Trafficking, a global industry. Forget about how you'll spend your weekend. Forget about what college you are going to attend. Forget about seeing your family again. Forget about life as you know it. Now imagine a whole new life. Imagine a life where you were sold by your family at an age as young as 12 years old into a life of slavery. This life of slavery is what we know to be called human trafficking, or modern-day slavery, which is the second largest criminal trade in the world. According to Anti-Slavery International, more than 20 million people from countries such as Thailand, Brazil, China, India, Ethiopia, Mauritania, Nigeria, Cameroon, Poland, Russia, Brazil, and Mexico are estimated to be in bondage today. We, especially as Christians, are obligated to be, if nothing more, aware of this growing issue so that we can help do our part and end the global plague of human trafficking. It is an unjust, cruel, gruesome, and wholly wrong issue that does not belong in our world, yet it is one of the most profitable trades in the world. First, we must ask ourselves, what does human trafficking look like today? The phrase human trafficking can be defined as the recruitment, transportation, harboring, or taking of people by means of threat, force, coercion, abduction, fraud, or deception for the purpose of exploiting them. The many facets of modern-day slavery or human trafficking include the sex entertainment industry or prostitution and various forms of labor exploitation. The most common form of slavery today is the form of labor exploitation. In many countries, workers with poor families are often targeted and are assured a new job in a distant city with good pay, but are given jobs instead with often zero pay, long hours, and no escape. In other cases, poor families are often even forced to sell their own children in order to provide for their families, children who will then be used as sex slaves or for labor to produce goods that later stock the shelves of Western clothing stores, carpet dealers, and chocolate makers. See, the truth is that slave labor is much cheaper than labor in developed countries, and businesses here in the West have come to realize and take advantage of this truth. There are many factors that have contributed to the rise of human trafficking, including lack of employment opportunities, poverty, corruption, decline of border patrols, gender and ethnic discrimination, conflicts, and lastly, globalization. While many of these issues have almost always existed, globalization has only recently come into play. The rise of globalization, the greater mobility of goods and people, and more rapid communications has caused a phenomenal growth in the trafficking business since the 1980s. With the rise in technology and communications, traffickers are connected to the global market for their goods. Traffickers now use email, text messages, and online chat rooms to discuss or manage their trafficking rings. These developments in technology and communications have widened the gap in many countries between the rich and the poor, providing more possible victims to be exploited. Another major contributor to the surge in the human trafficking business was the end of the Cold War. After the fall of the USSR, many satellite countries or small states sought independence and declared themselves new nations. This led to the rise of many power-hungry leaders in already war-torn areas. With all these conflicts came more poverty, a wider gap between the rich and the poor, limited border patrols, and widespread devastation, a breeding ground for trafficking victims. Because of this inadequate border patrol, these countries are now huge transit and destination countries for trafficking victims. Many of these countries, in Europe, 25 to be exact, simply do not even require a passport to enter its borders. This only facilitates the flow of slaves in and out of European countries. Globalization and the fall of the Soviet Union provided many opportunities for traffickers to seize upon the plight of the needy, impoverished, and dependent people in the far corners of the earth. But nothing fueled and continues to fuel human trafficking more than demand. Many of the world's citizens would never buy illegal drugs or smuggle weapons, but consumers will use the products produced by trafficking victims without thinking about why they're available at such an affordable price. Not only did the consumers benefit from cheap prices, but the business owners and companies also save money through some minimum or no wages at the expense of the slave worker. This problem becomes a much more personal issue when people realize that we too can be a piece of the global problem of modern-day slavery. The global human trafficking business is described as diverse network structures, but are increasingly becoming more professional, entrepreneurial, and less visible. Secure communications, tight coordinating between buyers and sellers, and diverse connections between groups of traffickers have all become so secure that law enforcement has no prior warning to their activities. These secure activities result from the wide array of facilitators who aid these traffickers in the smuggling and distribution of victims. These facilitators include security and law enforcement officials, as well as others such as travel agents, hotel owners, operators of safe houses, nightclub owners and managers, apartment owners, and newspaper publishers. In contrast to drug smuggling, traffickers of persons exercise teamwork as opposed to competition. You see, competition is huge among drug smugglers, often contributing to the rise in violence. But for human traffickers, violence is directed almost exclusively at the trafficking victims or their families rather than their criminal rivals. In some parts of the world, traditional animosities among ethnic groups are often ignored to obtain profit. This is exemplified in the cooperation of Israeli and Arab traffickers in the Sinai. All these components of the international trafficking business have contributed to the rise of major human trafficking groups around the world. While the human trafficking epidemic runs rampant throughout the world, the United States acts as a major source country for trafficking victims. It is estimated that the yearly average for American victims forced into the sex trade ranges from 100,000 to 300,000, mostly from the millions of children who run away or are thrown out of their homes annually. These victims, some as young as 12 years old, live on an average of 7 years after being forced to sell their bodies for sex. What makes America so negatively unique in the human trafficking business is its diverse pool of victims of which to choose as a result of the broad ranges of cultures and ethnic groups that populate our country. According to the American Community Survey, more than 37 million Americans were born outside of the country, many of whom either entered the country illegally or violated the conditions of their visas. This toleration we exhibit in our country concerning these illegal immigrants, as a result of the demand for inexpensive labor, provides a large number of possible individuals to be exploited by traffickers. Now, this does not mean I am supportive of removing immigrants or preventing them from entering our country, but I believe we must strengthen the control we have on our borders in order to lessen the amount of problems that have arisen without it. According to the NHTRC, the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline, more reports are made regarding potential human trafficking cases in California than in any other state. In California, gangs and cartels have recently expanded their trade to trafficking not only drugs and guns, but also humans, especially from Mexico. Gangs set up cross-border tunnels to move guns, drugs, and individuals while setting aside traditional rivalries to create trafficking rings and maximize profits. According to the Office of the Attorney General of California, 56% of the victims brought into California were used in the sex trade, while 23% were used in labor trade and 21% in other various forms of trafficking. Usually, as is the case throughout the rest of the world, labor trafficking is a more common type of slavery. But as this data shows, more victims of sex trafficking are being brought into California. In our particular region of Northern California, many cases of sex trafficking rings have been exposed, especially in the last 5 years. In January of last year, a ring of traffickers was exposed with brothels in cities like Stockton, Chico, Fairfield, and Yuba City. Women from Central America and Mexico were being transported illegally into Northern California and forced to sell their bodies for sex in houses in and around our area. In order to keep the women from being discovered, the traffickers would constantly move the victims around on buses to work in new cities. Obviously, the problem of human trafficking is considered not only morally wrong, but completely evil in the eyes of God and Christians. After all, we are made in God's image, and when someone defaces an image of a person, they deface the image of God as well. According to the UCAT, a teenage version of the Catholic belief system, no human being, not even parts of a human being, may be turned into commodities, nor may a person make himself a commodity. This means that individuals may not be taken advantage of for sex, labor, or any other means of slavery. This belief is shared by the Eastern Orthodox Church. Father John Matusiak from the Orthodox Church in America said that while the church does not have an official policy on the issue, it is obvious that Christians should not engage in such practices, and that everyone would be expected to safeguard the lives of others to the extent that they are able. Father Matusiak's statements say that it is not only morally wrong to take part in the trafficking of persons, but also to turn a blind eye to the innocent victims. The United Methodist Church also condemns slavery as wrong and incompatible with Christ's teachings, and each person is of equal value in the sight of God. In many cultures, women are often seen as less valuable or less important than men, and are as a result seen as objects to be used in the sex industry. The church also believes that sexuality is a glorious gift from God, meant to honor Him and not to be used to harm, demean, or abuse others. And lastly, the Evangelical Free Church is also strongly against the trafficking of persons while saying, We need to take the Bible's teachings of how to treat each other and their relationships with each other and let that become the bedrock for the value of the human life. All these denominations are in sharp agreement that the issue of human trafficking in our world, our nation, our state, and our city is in stark opposition to the Christian message. In response to this, many of us may remember that verse we have all seen in the Bible where it plainly says, "Slaves, obey your masters," which is found in Colossians 3. Or maybe the parable in Luke chapter 12 where it describes how to treat one's slave. So why aren't we as Christians as supportive of slavery in our world today as they were in the days of Jesus? Well, let's take a closer look. In Mark chapter 12, it says, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God's." So because Caesar and the Romans permitted the act of slavery, or owning a slave, it became a sort of social norm in those biblical times. In Romans 13, it is written that we must obey the authorities God has placed over us on the earth. And during those days, the leaders and everyone else were in agreement that owning a slave or servant was simply acceptable. This belief was only changed some 150 years ago. Since we have been raised under a government and authority that disproves the act of slavery, we also agree that it is simply wrong. In the biblical times, the Jews and everyone else under Roman rule had no say in what rules took place, but today we have a free, democratic understanding of how society works. You see, we as Christians have a voice today and are more involved in the political process, so we are able to change things and issues that the early church simply could not. So what can we do as average Joes to help fight the worldwide human trafficking plague? Well, first we must understand that there's no perfect list of 10 things that you can do to make America slavery-free, but we are able to do our part in order to combat this ginormous issue. The first step in doing our part is knowledge. While we know simple awareness will never end these issues, we also know they will never end without it. If we continue to be ignorant about the issue, it will only continue to grow until it's affecting everyone around us. So how can we raise awareness? Well, one way is to be a voice and tell others around you that this issue still exists today. You can write to your local politician. Many states here in our country still do not have laws protecting trafficking victims. And lastly, you can find out your slavery footprint at slaveryfootprint.org. The second step in the battle for the victims of slavery is prayer. We must constantly be in faithful and unceasing prayer for the victims who are struggling daily to live their lives in horror. After all, this is both a human and spiritual struggle. The third step in the fight is the act of prevention. Benjamin Franklin once said, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." We can help prevent further growth of this problem by raising awareness. You see, many people in our country and in our world simply do not know that slavery still exists today, since it is so different than the familiar images of whips, chains, and slave auctions that has characterized slavery in our country in the past. By helping others become more aware of the problem, more individuals can join the fight against trafficking. The fourth step in fighting this issue is that we need to learn to value the human life. Our culture and our world does a very good job of objectifying women and downgrading them from humans to items. We must watch the words we use to communicate with each other, even if we may just be joking around with our friends. Drew Tollenar talked about this in his senior project, but the human trafficking business and the pornography business are directly linked, and whenever someone watches pornography, they're contributing to the trafficking business. Traffickers will not only use their victims as slaves, but also in pornography in order to make more money. The final step in combating modern-day slavery is action. Whether it be volunteering at an aftercare facility, donating to organizations fighting the problem, or joining campaigns to help save victims caught in human trafficking, we all can take some form of action to lessen the problem. There are many organizations and websites you can go to in order to learn more about how you can join the fight, including the End It Movement, the A21 campaign, and the Polaris Project. These are the steps we must take if we desire to help remove this rapidly growing issue from our area and our world. Harriet Tubman once said, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if they knew they were victims." Millions of trafficking victims, especially American runaways, are unaware that they are in fact victims. They see their pimp or trafficker as their only true family and continue to depend on them for survival. We must learn to be a voice for the voiceless, a light for the hopeless, and a defender of the weak. Psalm 82:3 tells us to defend the weak and the fatherless, defend the rights of the poor and suffering, save the weak and the helpless, and free them from the power of the wicked. We are called to fight for those in debt bondage, working 20 hours a day with no pay. We are called to come to the aid of boys taken from their homes in Africa to become child soldiers. We are called to defend the women and children forced to have sex with 300 men a month. These are the weak and helpless in need of someone and anyone to stand up and fight for them. William Wilberforce, a leading abolitionist of the slave trade, said, "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know." Now that we are aware of this gross issue, we simply cannot look away, because the 20 million people in the world under the oppression of human trafficking can look to no one but us. Thank you. Are there any questions?